His fellow soldiers hated him. They beat him. They called him a coward. He refused to carry a weapon into combat, believing it was against God's commandments to kill. Then came the Battle of Okinawa, when his entire company was pinned down by Japanese fire, when dozens of wounded men lay dying on the battlefield. He did something no one thought possible. He saved 75 men, one at a time, lowering them down a 400-foot cliff while under constant enemy fire. He never fired a shot. This is the story of the only conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. Stay until the end to discover what he prayed before every rescue, words that gave him the courage to save one more life. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, a small city in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He entered a world of American isolationism between the world wars, a nation trying to forget the horrors of World War I and hoping to avoid future conflicts. His father, William Thomas Doss, was a carpenter who had served in World War I and carried physical and psychological scars from that service. His mother, Bertha Edward Doss, was a devout Seventh-day Adventist who raised her children with strict religious principles. Young Desmond, called Desi by his family, grew up in a household where faith, hard work, and nonviolence were central values. The Doss family struggled financially during the Great Depression. Desmond's father worked when carpentry jobs were available, but often faced unemployment during the worst economic years. The family survived through a combination of his father's occasional work, his mother's resourcefulness, and assistance from their church community. Desmond learned early that life was hard, that survival required determination, and that faith provided strength when material resources were scarce. He also learned the importance of community. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in Lynchburg helped families through difficult times, creating bonds of mutual support that Desmond would carry throughout his life. Seventh-day Adventist theology shaped Desmond's worldview fundamentally. The church taught that the Bible should be interpreted literally, that the Ten Commandments were absolute rules for living, and that Saturday, the seventh day, was the proper Sabbath for worship. Most importantly for Desmond's future, the church taught nonviolence, that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," meant exactly that, with no exceptions for warfare. Seventh-day Adventists were conscientious objectors, believing that Christians should not participate in killing even when their country was at war. But the Seventh-day Adventist position on military service was nuanced. While the church opposed killing, it didn't oppose military service entirely. Adventists were encouraged to serve as non-combatants, medics who saved lives rather than taking them. This allowed Adventists to fulfill military obligations and serve their country while remaining true to their religious beliefs about not killing. Desmond absorbed this teaching, believing from childhood that if war came, he would serve as a combat medic, saving lives while refusing to carry weapons. A traumatic childhood incident reinforced Desmond's commitment to nonviolence. His father, suffering from what we now understand as PTSD from World War I, struggled with alcohol and anger. One day, during a violent argument with Desmond's uncle, his father pulled a gun and nearly shot his own brother. Desmond's mother intervened, and young Desmond took the gun away from his father and hid it. The incident terrified Desmond. He had seen how easily violence could escalate to murder, how guns made killing too easy, how even good men could become killers in moments of rage. He vowed never to touch a gun again. Desmond attended school through 10th grade before leaving to work and help support his family. He worked various jobs, in a lumber mill, as a carpenter's apprentice working with his father, doing whatever work was available during the Depression years. He was a hard worker, but quiet and unassuming, with a gentle manner that sometimes led people to underestimate him. He attended church faithfully, studied the Bible intensively, and developed the firm religious convictions that would later be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. In 1940, Desmond met Dorothy Shute at church. She was vivacious and outgoing, where Desmond was quiet and reserved, but they complemented each other perfectly. They began courting, with Desmond's gentle manner and deep faith attracting Dorothy despite, or perhaps because of, his unconventional views about war and violence. They fell in love and planned to marry, but world events intervened before they could. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered World War II. Desmond, now 22 years old, faced the decision that would define his life. Like all American men his age, he was required to register for the draft. But as a Seventh-day Adventist and conscientious objector, he faced a choice: claim exemption from military service based on religious beliefs or volunteer as a non-combatant medic. Many Seventh-day Adventists chose exemption. Desmond chose to serve. He volunteered for the Army Medical Corps in April 1942, specifically requesting assignment as a combat medic. His decision wasn't motivated by patriotism or desire for glory. Desmond was genuinely opposed to war and believed all killing was wrong. But he also believed that if war came, wounded soldiers would need medical care, and providing that care was consistent with his faith. He could serve without killing, saving lives while others taking them. Desmond absorbed this teaching, believing from childhood that if war came, he would serve as a combat medic, saving lives while refusing to carry weapons.
His fellow soldiers and some officers viewed Desmond as a coward hiding behind religion to avoid combat. They didn't understand that Desmond had volunteered for the Army and specifically requested combat medic duty, the most dangerous non-combatant role. They saw only that he refused to carry a weapon and wouldn't train on Saturdays. Some soldiers tried to get Desmond to quit through harassment, hiding his Bible, mocking his faith, physically attacking him. Desmond endured all of it without retaliating, maintaining his commitment to nonviolence even when being beaten by fellow soldiers. His company commander, Captain Jack Glover, tried multiple times to have Desmond discharged from the Army or transferred to non-combat duties. Glover believed Desmond would get people killed, that in combat, a medic who wouldn't carry a weapon was a liability who couldn't defend himself or others. Glover tried to have Desmond declared mentally unfit for service. He tried to have him court-martialed for refusing to obey orders to carry a weapon. But Desmond had military regulations on his side. The Army allowed conscientious objectors to serve as non-combatants, and Desmond's religious beliefs were genuine and documented. The situation reached crisis point when Desmond was briefly placed under arrest for refusing direct orders to carry a weapon. A court-martial seemed certain, which would have ended Desmond's military career in disgrace. But intervention from higher command, combined with verification of his Seventh-day Adventist beliefs, resulted in charges being dropped. Desmond was allowed to continue training as a medic without carrying weapons. But his company remained hostile. Most soldiers still viewed him as a coward, and many vowed they wouldn't protect him in combat. Despite the hostility, Desmond excelled in medic training. He learned battlefield medicine, how to stop bleeding, treat shock, apply tourniquets, administer morphine, stabilize injured soldiers for evacuation. He studied trauma care, learned to work under pressure, and developed the skills that would later save dozens of lives. He also maintained his physical fitness, proving he wasn't avoiding weapons due to cowardice, but genuine religious conviction. He could have performed infantry duties if he had been willing to kill. He simply wasn't willing. In 1944, the 77th Infantry Division deployed to the Pacific Theater. They fought in the Philippines, participating in the battle for light. Desmond finally got the opportunity to prove himself in combat. When soldiers were wounded under fire, Desmond ran into danger to treat and evacuate them without carrying a weapon for self-defense. He treated wounded men while bullets flew around him, dragged injured soldiers to safety, and worked with complete disregard for his own safety. His company began to realize that Desmond wasn't a coward. He had courage, just expressed differently than they expected. In the Philippines, Desmond won the respect of men who had despised him during training. Captain Glover, who had tried to have Desmond discharged, publicly apologized and admitted he had been wrong about him. Soldiers who had mocked his faith now trusted him completely. They knew that if they were wounded, Desmond would risk his life to save them regardless of the danger. His refusal to carry weapons was no longer seen as cowardice, but as extraordinary commitment to his principles. Then came May 1945 and the Battle of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War and one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The 77th Division was assigned to capture the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot-high ridge that American soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge. Japanese forces had fortified the ridge with artillery, machine guns, and extensive underground positions. Capturing it would require scaling the cliff under fire, then holding the top against Japanese counterattacks. On April 29, 1945, Desmond's company climbed cargo nets hung over Hacksaw Ridge's cliff face, reaching the top and establishing a precarious foothold. Immediately, Japanese forces counterattacked. Artillery and mortar fire rained down. Japanese soldiers emerged from underground tunnels and bunkers, attacking with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. American casualties were immediate and heavy. Wounded soldiers lay across the ridgetop, unable to be evacuated because Japanese fire was too intense. Desmond went to work. While other soldiers fought and tried to hold the position, Desmond moved across the battlefield treating wounded men. He crawled through enemy fire, applied tourniquets and bandages, administered morphine, and dragged wounded soldiers toward the cliff edge where they could be lowered to safety. Japanese soldiers shot at him repeatedly. Bullets hit the ground around him. He was grazed by shrapnel. But Desmond kept working, moving from one wounded man to the next, refusing to take cover while wounded men needed help. The company commander ordered a withdrawal. Japanese pressure was too intense, casualties were too high, the position couldn't be held. American soldiers began retreating back to the cargo nets to climb down the cliff. But dozens of wounded men remained on top of Hacksaw Ridge, unable to move on their own. Evacuating them seemed impossible. Japanese fire was too heavy, and climbing down the nets while carrying wounded men would be suicidal. The wounded would have to be left behind, likely to die from their wounds or be captured and killed by Japanese forces.
Desmond refused to leave. While his company retreated down the cliff, he remained on top of Hacksaw Ridge with the wounded. He rigged a rope sling system using a cargo net and a double bowline knot he had learned as a Boy Scout. He dragged wounded men to the cliff edge one at a time, secured them in the rope sling, and lowered them down the 400-foot cliff face to safety. Then he pulled the rope back up and repeated the process with another wounded man. For 5 hours, while Japanese forces controlled most of the ridgetop and fired at him repeatedly, Desmond worked alone, lowering wounded men down the cliff. Each time he secured someone in the rope sling, he prayed, "Lord, please help me get one more." Then he lowered that man to safety and went back for another. One more, then one more, then one more. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening, ignoring his own wounds, his exhaustion, and the constant danger. When darkness finally forced Japanese forces to pull back temporarily, Desmond climbed down the cliff, the last man to leave Hacksaw Ridge. His company counted the wounded men he had saved, 75 men who would have died if Desmond had retreated with everyone else. 75 men saved by a soldier who refused to carry a weapon, who had been despised as a coward, who proved that courage comes in many forms. But Desmond wasn't finished. Over the following weeks, as the battle for Okinawa continued, Desmond continued working as a combat medic. On May 21st, he was wounded by a grenade while treating other wounded soldiers. Shrapnel tore into his legs and body. While waiting for evacuation, he saw another wounded soldier who was more seriously injured. Desmond gave up his stretcher to that soldier and waited hours for another litter, his own wounds untreated. During the wait, he was shot through the arm by a Japanese sniper's bullet, fracturing his arm badly. These wounds finally ended Desmond's combat service. He was evacuated to hospitals, underwent multiple surgeries, and faced a long recovery. His injuries were severe enough that he was medically discharged from the Army, but his service had left an indelible mark. Captain Jack Glover, who had tried to have Desmond discharged as unfit, personally recommended him for the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration.
On October 12, 1945, President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Corporal Desmond Doss at the White House. The citation specifically noted that Desmond had saved 75 men without carrying weapons, demonstrating courage beyond measure while adhering to his religious principles. Truman shook Desmond's hand and told him he considered Desmond's actions the most incredible display of courage he had heard about during the entire war. Desmond became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. After the war, Desmond married Dorothy, his longtime fiancée who had waited for him throughout his military service. They tried to build a normal life, but Desmond's health was shattered. His war wounds left him partially disabled. He also contracted tuberculosis while recovering from his injuries, requiring the surgical removal of one lung and multiple ribs. The tuberculosis treatment in the 1940s involved strong antibiotics that caused permanent hearing loss. Desmond spent years in and out of hospitals, struggling with pain and disability. Despite his health problems, Desmond lived a life of service and faith. He worked when his health allowed, raised a son with Dorothy, and remained active in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He rarely spoke about his war service, uncomfortable with being called a hero. He insisted he had simply done his duty, that any combat medic would have done the same. The men he saved disagreed. They knew what Desmond had done was extraordinary, that most men would not have risked their lives repeatedly to save others. Dorothy died in 1991, after 47 years of marriage. Desmond was devastated, but continued living, eventually remarrying in 1993 to Frances Duman, who cared for him as his health continued declining. In his final decades, Desmond's story became more widely known. Documentaries were made about his service. Schools invited him to speak to students about courage and conviction. Veterans organizations honored him at commemorations. Desmond participated in these events when his health allowed, but he always insisted the focus should be on all soldiers, not just himself. In 2004, at 85 years old, Desmond attended the dedication of the USS Doss, a Navy cargo ship named in his honor. It was an unusual honor for an enlisted soldier, particularly a conscientious objector, but it reflected the respect military and civilian leaders had for his achievements. Desmond was frail and required a wheelchair, but he attended the ceremony and thanked the Navy for the honor. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at age 87, at his home in Alabama. His funeral was attended by veterans, religious leaders, and people whose lives he had touched. He was buried at Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee. In 2016, 10 years after his death, director Mel Gibson released Hacksaw Ridge, a film dramatizing Desmond's story. The film was nominated for 6 Academy Awards and introduced Desmond's story to millions who had never heard of him. Desmond's legacy challenges conventional notions of military courage. He proved that courage doesn't require weapons, that strength can manifest through healing rather than killing, that conviction can coexist with service. Modern militaries studying combat motivation recognize that soldiers like Desmond, motivated by saving lives rather than taking them, can be as valuable as aggressive fighters. His story has influenced military policies regarding religious accommodation and conscientious objection. The moment that defines Desmond's legacy came in an interview late in his life when someone asked if he ever regretted not carrying a weapon, if he ever felt he could have saved more men if he had been able to defend himself with a rifle. Desmond thought carefully before answering, his hearing aids whistling slightly, his frail hands shaking from age and illness. He said he never regretted his decision. Carrying a weapon would have changed who he was. He would have become a soldier who killed as well as healed, and he believed the commandment against killing was absolute. God had protected him through the war despite, or perhaps because of, his refusal to kill. The 75 men he saved at Hacksaw Ridge and the many others he treated throughout the war were alive because he had focused entirely on saving lives rather than dividing his attention between healing and killing. His weakness, as the world saw it, had been his strength. That was Desmond Doss, a soldier who saved 75 men without firing a shot, a conscientious objector who proved that courage takes many forms, a man who stayed true to his faith even when everyone around him said he was wrong. His story reminds us that heroism isn't defined by killing enemies, but by saving friends, that strength sometimes means refusing violence, and that the greatest warriors might be those who heal rather than harm.